Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom, Scholem, Abulafia, and the Doctrine of Prophetic Kabbalism. Abulafia then wandered about Italy for a number of years. Of these, he seems to have spent several in Sicily, where he remained longer than in any other place. Almost all his extant works were written during his Italian period, particularly between the years 1279 and 1291 of the Common Era. We are altogether ignorant of his fate after the year 1291. Of his prophetic or inspired writings, only his Apocalypse, Sefer Ha'oth, or the Book of the Sign, a strange and not altogether comprehensible book, has survived. On the other hand, most of his theoretical and doctrinal treatises are still extant, some of them in a considerable number of manuscripts. He seems to have made many enemies by claiming prophetical inspiration and antagonizing his contemporaries in various other ways, for he very often complains of hostility and persecution. He means denunciations by Jews to Christian authorities, which may perhaps be explained by the fact that he represented himself as a prophet to Christians as well. Well, if you're claiming to be a prophet of God, it's to everybody, right? He writes that he found among them some who believed more in God than the Jews, to whom God had sent him first. Now, that's probably more true than ever. Some of these ruling Jewish families that people talk about, they're not Jewish by religion, and some of them are about as strongly atheist as you can, bring up, right? He writes that he found among them some who believed more in God than the Jews to whom God had sent him first. In two places, Abulafia tells of his connection with non-Jewish mystics. Once, he relates, he talked with them about the three methods of the interpretation of the Torah: literal, allegoric, and mystic. And he noted their agreement with one another while conversing with them confidentially, and I saw that they belonged to the category of the pious of the Gentiles, and that the words of the fools of whatever religion need not be heeded, for the Torah has been handed over to the masters of true knowledge. Another time he tells of a dispute with a Christian scholar with whom he had made friends, and in whose mind he had implanted the desire for the knowledge of the name of God, and it is not necessary to reveal more about it. These connections of Abulafia's do not, however, testify to a special inclination to Christian ideas, as some scholars have assumed. On the contrary, his antagonism to Christianity is very outspoken and intense. He sometimes, indeed, intentionally makes use, among many other associations, of formulae which sound quite Trinitarian, immediately giving them a meaning which has nothing whatsoever to do with the Trinitarian idea of God, but his predilection for paradox, as well as his prophetic pretensions, alienated from him the Kabbalist of a more strictly orthodox orientation, and indeed he acutely criticizes the Kabbalists of his times and their symbolism insofar as it is not backed by individual mystical experience. On the other hand, some of his writings are devoted to the refutation of attacks directed against him by orthodox Kabbalists, but poverty, exile, and imprisonment were powerless to make Abulafia, a proud and unbending spirit, abandon the standpoint to which his personal experience of things divine had led him. In the preface to one of his works, the main part of which has been lost, he compares his mission and his place among his contemporaries with that of the prophet Isaiah. He tells how a voice called him twice, "Abraham, Abraham," and he continues, "I said, here I am." Thereupon he instructed me in the right way, woke me from my slumber, and inspired me to write something new. There had been nothing like it in my day. He realized only too well that his gospel would make enemies for him among the Jewish leaders. Nevertheless, he submitted to this, and I constrained my will and dared to reach beyond my grasp. They called me heretic, an unbeliever, because I had resolved to worship God in truth, and not as those who walk in darkness. Sunken in the abyss, they and their kind would have delighted to engulf me in their vanities and their dark deeds, but God forbid that I should forsake the way of truth for that of falsehood. Yet, for all his pride in the achievement of prophetic inspiration and his knowledge of the great name of God, there was combined in his character meekness and a love of peace. Jelinek rightly points out that his moral character must be estimated very highly. When accepting disciples to his Kabbalah, he is extremely fastidious in his requirements as to a high morality and steadiness of character, and it may be concluded from his writings, even in their ecstatic parts, that he himself possessed many of the qualities he asks for in others. He who gains the deepest knowledge of the true essentials of reality, so he says in one place, at the same time, acquires the deepest humility and modesty. It is one of the many oddities of the history of modern research into Kabbalism that Abulafia, of all men, has sometimes made out to be the anonymous author of the Zohar. This hypothesis, which still finds its supporters, was first advanced by M.H. Landauer, who, 100 years ago, was the first to point to Abulafia at all. He says, I found a strange man, with whose writings the contents of the Zohar coincide most accurately down to the minutest details. This fact struck me at once with the first writing of his which came into my hands. But now that I have read many of his works and have come to know his life, his principles, and his character, there cannot exist any longer even the slightest doubt that we now have the author of the Zohar. This seems to me an extraordinary example of how a judgment proclaimed with conviction as certainly true may nevertheless be entirely wrong in every detail. Well, not every detail, but we know who wrote the Zohar. The truth is that no two things could have been more different than the outlook of the Zohar and that of Abulafia. 4. I shall now try to give a brief, synthetic description, one after the other, of the main points of his mystical theory, his doctrine of the search of ecstasy and for prophetic inspiration. Its basic principles have been upheld with varying modifications by all those among the Kabbalists who found in Abulafia a congenial spirit, and its characteristic mixture of emotionalism and rationalism sets its seal on one of the main trends of Kabbalism. Abulafia's aim, as he himself has expressed it, is to unseal the soul, to untie the knots which bind it. All the inner forces in the hidden souls of man are distributed and differentiated in the bodies. It is, however, in the nature of all them that when their knots are untied, they return to their origin, which is one without any duality, which compromises the multiplicity. The untying, as it were, the return from multiplicity and separation towards the original unity, as a symbol of the great mystic liberation of the soul from the fetters of sensuality. The untying of knots occurs also in the theosophy of Northern Buddhism. Only recently, a French scholar published a Tibetan didactic tract, the title of which may be translated Book on Untying Knots. What does this symbol mean in Abulafia's terminology? It means that there are certain barriers which separate the personal existence of the soul from the stream of cosmic life, personified for him in the intellectus agens of the philosophers, which runs through the whole of creation. There is a dam which keeps the soul confined within the natural and normal borders of human existence and protects it against the flood of the divine stream, which flows beneath it or all around it. The same dam, however, also prevents the soul from taking cognizance of the divine. The seals which are impressed on the soul protect it against the flood and guarantee its normal functioning. Why is the soul, as it were, sealed up? Because, answers Abulafia, the ordinary day-to-day life of human beings, their perception of the sensible world, fills and impregnates the mind with a multitude of sensible forms or images, called in the language of medieval philosophers, natural forms. As the mind perceives all kinds of gross natural objects and admits their images into consciousness, it creates for itself, out of this natural function, a certain mode of existence which bears the stamp of finiteness. The normal life of the soul, in other words, is kept within the limits determined by our sensory perceptions and emotions, and as long as it is full of these, it finds it extremely difficult to perceive the existence of spiritual forms and things divine. The problem, therefore, is to find a way of helping the soul to perceive more than the forms of nature, without its becoming blinded and overwhelmed by the divine light, and the solution is suggested by the old adage, whoever is full of himself has no room for God. All that which occupies the natural self of man must either be made to disappear or must be transformed in such a way as to render it transparent for the inner spiritual reality, whose contours will then become perceptible through the customary shell of natural things. Abulafia therefore casts his eyes round for higher forms of perception, which, instead of blocking the way to the soul's own deeper regions, facilitates access to them and throw them into relief. He wants the soul to concentrate on highly abstract spiritual matters, which will not encumber it by pushing their own particular importance into the foreground, and thus render illusory the whole purpose of mental purgation. If, for instance, I observe a flower, a bird, or some other concrete thing or event and begin to think about it, the object of my reflection has an importance or attractiveness of its own. I'm thinking of this particular flower, bird, etc. Then, how can the soul learn to visualize God with the help of objects whose nature is of such a sort as to arrest the attention of the speculator and deflect it from its purpose? The early Jewish mystic knows of no object of contemplation in which the soul immerses itself until it reaches a state of ecstasy such as the passion in Christian mysticism. Abraham Abulafia is therefore compelled to look for an, as it were, absolute object for meditating upon, that is to say, one capable of stimulating the soul's deeper life and freeing it from ordinary perceptions. In other words, he looks for something capable of acquiring the highest importance without having much particular, or if possible, any importance of its own. An object which fulfills all these conditions he believes himself to have found in the Hebrew alphabet, in the letters which make up the written language. It is not enough, though, an important step forward, that the soul should be occupied with the meditation of abstract truths, for even there it remains too closely bound to their specific meaning. Rather, it is Abulafia's purpose to present it with something not merely abstract, but also not determinable, as an object in the strict sense, for everything so determined has an importance and an individuality of its own. Basing himself upon the abstract and non-corporeal nature of script, he develops a theory of the mystical contemplation of letters and their configurations as the constituents of God's name, for this is real, and if I may say so, the peculiarly Jewish object of mystical contemplation, the name of God, which is something absolute because it reflects the hidden meaning and totality of existence, the name through which everything else acquires its meaning, and which yet to the human mind has no concrete particular meaning of its own. In short, Abulafia believes that whoever succeeds in making this great name of God at least concrete and perceptible thing in the world, the object of his meditation is on the way to true mystical ecstasy. Starting from this concept, Abulafia expounds a peculiar discipline, which he calls Hokmath ha-Tesaruf, i.e. the science of the combination of letters. This is described as a methodical guide to meditation with the aid of letters and their configurations. Individual letters of their combinations need have no meaning in the ordinary sense. It is even an advantage if they are meaningless, as in that case they are less likely to distract us. True, they are not really meaningless to Abulafia, who accepts the Kabbalistic doctrine of divine language as the substance of reality. According to this doctrine, as I have mentioned in the first lecture, all things exist only by virtue of their degree of participation in the great name of God, which manifests itself through the whole creation. There is a language which expresses the pure thought of God, and the letters of this spiritual language are the elements both of the most fundamental spiritual reality and of the the profoundest understanding and knowledge. Abulafia's mysticism is a course in this divine language. The purpose of this discipline is then to stimulate, with the aid of methodical meditation, a new state of consciousness. This state can be best defined as an harmonious movement of pure thought, which has severed all relation to the senses. Abulafia himself has already quite correctly compared it with music. Indeed, the systematic practice of meditation, as taught by him, produces a sensation closely akin to that of listening to musical harmonies. The science of combination is a music of pure thought in which the alphabet takes the place of the musical scale. The whole system shows a fairly close resemblance to musical principles applied not to sounds, but to thought and meditation. We find here compositions and modifications of motifs and their combination in every possible variety. This is what Abulafia himself says about it in one of his unpublished writings. Know that the method of tasarruf can be compared to music, for the ear hears sounds from the various combinations in accordance with the character of the melody and the instrument. Also, two different instruments can form a combination, and if the sounds combine, the listener's ear registers a pleasant sensation in acknowledging their difference. The strings touched by the right or left hand move, and the sound is sweet to the ear, and from the ear the sensation travels to the heart, and from the heart to the spleen, the center of emotion. The enjoyment of the different melodies produces ever new delight. It is impossible to produce it except through the combination of sounds. And the same is true of the combination of letters. It touches the first string, which is comparable to the first letter, and proceeds to the second, third, fourth, and fifth, and the various sounds combine, and the secrets which express themselves in these combinations delight the heart, which acknowledges its God, and is filled with ever fresh joy. The directed activity of the adept engaged in combining and separating the letters in his meditation, composing whole motifs on separate groups, combining several of them with one another, and enjoying their combinations in every direction, is, therefore, for Abulafia, not more senseless or incomprehensible than that of a composer. Just as, to quote Schopenhauer, the musician expresses in wordless sounds the world once again, and ascends to endless heights and descends to endless depths, so the mystic. To him the closed doors of the soul open in the music of pure thought, which is no longer bound to sense, and in the ecstasy of the deepest harmonies which originate in the movement of the letters of the great name. They throw open the way to God. Now, this sort of letter mysticism has really, in the past 10, 15 years, made its appearance into the Enochian system. And this letter mysticism, of course, being beyond semantics and beyond, other elements of looking at the meaning of the words that you put together. I mean, there's some that incorporate some of that stuff, but, Oh, I forget what was the first book published. Constantinos? Was it his book, or? I've said something about that elsewhere. But anyways, the science of the combination of letters and the practice of controlled meditation is, according to Abulafia, nothing less than the mystical logic, which corresponds to the inner harmony of thought in its movement towards God. The world of letters, which reveals itself in this discipline, is the true world of bliss. Every letter represents a whole world to the mystic, who abandons himself to its contemplation. Every language, not only Hebrew, is transformed into a transcendental medium of the one and only language of God. And as every language issues from a corruption of the aboriginal language, Hebrew, well, no, Hebrew is actually from Aramea. It has elements of Arabic and some others, but anyways, they all remain related to it. In all his books, Abulafia likes to play on Latin, Greek, and Italian words to support his ideas. For in the last resort, every spoken word consists of sacred letters, and the combination, separation, and reunion of letters reveal profound mysteries to the Kabbalist, and unravel to him the secret of the relation of all languages to the Holy Tongue. Part 5. Abulafia's great manuals, such as the Book of Eternal Life, The Light of the Intellect, The words beauty and the Book of Combination are systematic guides to the theory and practice of this system of mystical counterpoint. Through its methodical exercise, the soul is accustomed to the perception of higher forms with which it gradually saturates itself. Abulafia lays down a method which leads from the actual articulation of the permutations and combinations to their writing and to the contemplation of the written, and finally from writing to thinking and to the pure meditation of all these objects of the mystical logic. I keep wanting to say lodge. Articulation, mitvah, writing, miktav, and thought, machshav, thus form three superimposed layers of meditation. Letters are the elements of every one of them, elements which manifest themselves in ever more spiritual forms. From the motion of the letters of thought result the truths of reason. But the mystic will not stop here. He differentiates further between matter and form of the letters in order to approach closer to their spiritual nucleus. He immerses himself in the combinations of the pure forms of the letters, which now, being purely spiritual forms, impress themselves upon his soul. He endeavors to comprehend the connections between words and names formed by the Kabbalistic methods of exegesis. The numerical value of words, gematria, is here of particular importance. To this must be added another point. The modern reader of these writings will be most astonished to find a detailed description of a method which Abulafia and his followers call delug and kafetza, jumping or skipping these from one conception to another. In fact, this is nothing else than a very remarkable method of using associations as a way of meditation. It is not wholly free play of association. It is known to psychoanalysis. Rather, it is the way of passing from one association to another, determined by certain rules, which are, however, sufficiently lax. Every jump opens a new sphere defined by certain formal, not material, characteristics. Within this sphere, the mind may freely associate. The jumping unites, therefore, elements of free and guided association, and is said to assure quite extraordinary results as far as the widening of consciousness of the initiate is concerned. The jumping brings to light hidden processes of the mind. It liberates us from the prison of the natural sphere and leads us to the boundaries of the divine sphere. All the other, more simple methods of meditation serve only as a preparation for this highest grade which contains and supersedes all the others. Abulafia describes in several places the preparations for meditation and ecstasy, as well as what happens to the adept at the height of rapture. The report of one of his disciples, which I quote below, confirms his statements. Abulafia himself says in one place, "Be prepared for thy God, O Israelite. Make thyself ready to direct thy heart to God alone. Cleanse the body and choose a lonely house where none shall hear thy voice. Sit there in thy closet and do not reveal thy secret to any man. If thou canst do it by day in the house, but it is best if thou completest it during the night, in the hour when thou preparest thyself to speak with the Creator, and thou wishest him to reveal his might to thee, then be careful to abstract all thy thought from the vanities of this world. Cover thyself with thy prayer shawl, and put tefillin on thy head and hands, that thou mayest be filled with awe of the Shekinah, which is near thee. Cleanse thy clothes, and if possible, let all thy garments be white. For all this is helpful in leading the heart towards the fear of God and the love of God. If it be night, kindle many lights, until all be bright. Then take ink, pen, and a table to thy hand, and remember that thou art about to serve God, in joy of the gladness of heart. Now begin to combine a few or many letters, to permutate and to combine them until thy heart be warm. Then be mindful of their movements, and of what thou canst spring forth by moving them. And when thou feelest that thy heart is already warm, and when thou seest that by combinations of letters thou canst grasp new things, which by human tradition or by thyself thou wouldst not be able to know, and when thou art thus prepared to receive the influx of divine power which flows into thee, then turn all thy true thought to imagine the name, and his exalted angels in thy heart, as if they were human beings sitting or standing about thee, and feel thyself like an envoy whom the king and his ministers are to send on a mission. and he is waiting to hear something about his mission from their lips, be it from the king himself, be it from his servants. Having imagined this very vividly, turn thy whole mind to understand with thy thoughts the many things which will come into thy heart through the letters imagined. Ponder them as a whole, and in all their detail, like one to whom a parable or dream is being related, or who meditates on a deep problem in a scientific book, and try thus to interpret what thou shalt hear, that it may as far as possible accord with thy reason. And all this will happen to thee after having flung away tablet and quill, or after they will have dropped from thee because of the intensity of thy thought, and know the stronger the intellectual influx within thee, the weaker will become thy outer and inner parts. Thy whole body will be seized by an extremely strong trembling, so that thou wilt think that surely thou art about to die, because that thy soul, overjoyed with its knowledge, will leave thy body, and be thou ready at this moment consciously to choose death, and then thou shalt know that thou hast come far enough to receive the influx, and then wishing to honor the glorious name by serving it with the life of the body and soul, veil thy face, and be afraid to look at God. Then return to the matters of the body, rise and eat and drink a little, or refresh thyself with a pleasant odor, and restore thy spirit to its sheath until another time, and rejoice at thy lot, and know that God loveth thee. By training itself to turn its back upon all natural objects and to live in the pure contemplation of the divine name, the mind is gradually prepared for the final transformation. The seals which keep it locked up in its normal state and shut off the divine light are relaxed, and the mystic finally dispenses with them altogether. The hidden spring of divine life is released. But now that the mind has been prepared for it, this eruption of the divine influx does not overwhelm it and throws it into a state of confusion and self-abandonment. On the contrary, having climbed the seventh and last step of the mystical ladder and reached the summit, the mystic consciously perceives and becomes part of the world of divine light, whose radiance illuminates his thoughts and heals his heart. This is the stage of prophetic vision, in which the ineffable mysteries of the divine name and the whole glory of its realm reveal themselves to the illuminate. Of them the prophet speaks in words which extol the greatness of God and bear the reflection of his image. Ecstasy, which Abulafia regards as the highest reward of mystical contemplation, is not therefore to be confused with semi-conscious raving and complete self-annihilation. These uncontrolled forms of ecstasy he treats with a certain disdain and even regards them as dangerous. Rationally prepared ecstasy, too, comes suddenly and cannot be enforced. But when the bolts are shot back and the seals taken off, the mind is already prepared for the light of the intellect, which pours in. Abulafia therefore frequently warns against the mental and even physical dangers of unsystemic meditation and similar practices, and combining the letters, every one of which, according to the book Yetzirah, is coordinated to a special member of the body. One has to be most careful not to move a constant or vowel from its position, for if he errs in reading the letter commanding a certain member, that member may be torn away and may change its place or alter its nature immediately and be transformed into a different shape, so that in consequence that a person may become a cripple. In the account I'm going to quote at the end, Abulafia's disciple also mentions spasmodic distortions of the face. So a form of body dysmorphia. Well, I mean, if the face is twitching, but it can connect to that, right? Abulafia lays great emphasis on the newness and singularity of his prophecy. Know that most of the vision which Raziel saw are based on the name of God and its gnosis, and also on his new revelation which took place on earth, now in his days and the like. There was not from the time of Adam until his. The prophets who draw from the knowledge of the true name are at the same time to his mind the true lovers. The identity of prophecy with the love of God also finds its proof in the mysticism of numbers, and he who serves God out of pure love is on the right path towards prophecy. That is why Kabbalists, with whom the pure fear of God turns into love, are for him the genuine disciples of the prophets. 6. In the opinion of Abulafia, his own doctrine of prophetic ecstasy is, in the last resort, nothing but the doctrine of prophecy advanced by the Jewish philosophers, more especially by Maimonides, who also defines prophecy as a temporary union of the human and the divine intellect, deliberately brought about through the systemic preparation. The prophetic faculty, according to this doctrine, represents the union of the human intellect at the highest stage of its development with a cosmic influence, normally domiciled in the intelligible world. The so-called active intellectus agens, the influx of this active intellect, and the soul manifests itself as prophetic vision. Abulafia is concerned to prove the substantial identity of this theory of prophecy, which was widely recognized in the Middle Ages, with his own doctrine. These rationalizations cannot, however, obscure the fact that his teaching represents but a Judaized version of that ancient spiritual technique which has found its classical expression in the practices of the Indian mystics who follow the system known as yoga. To cite only one instance out of many, an important part in Abulafia's system is played by the technique of breathing. Now this technique has found its highest development in the Indian yoga, where it is commonly regarded as the most important instrument of mental discipline. Again, Abulafia lays down certain rules of body posture, certain corresponding combinations of constants and vowels, and certain forms of recitation, and in particular some passages of his book, The Light of the Intellect, give the impression of a Judaized treatise on yoga. The similarity even extends to some aspects of the doctrine of ecstatic vision as presented and brought about by those practices. For what is the reward of reaching the supreme stage of vision? We are repeatedly told by Abulafia that the visionary perceives the image of his spiritual mentor, usually visualized either as a young or old man, whom he not only sees but also hears. The body, Abulafia says, requires the physician of the body, the soul, the physician of the soul, to wit, the students of the Torah. But the intellect, the highest power of the soul, requires a mover from outside who has received Kabbalah concerning the mysteries of the Torah, and a mover from inside, Me'orer Penameh, who opens the closed doors before him. Elsewhere, too, he differentiates between the human and the divine teacher. If need be, one could manage without the former. Abulafia assumes that his own writings may possibly replace an immediate contact between disciple and teacher, yet by no means could one forego the spiritual teacher who confronts man at the secret gates of his soul. This spiritual mentor, in Indian terminology, the guru, personifies the intellectus again through the mythical figure of the angel Metatron, but he is also, according to certain passages, God himself as Shaddai. Shaddai kind of relates as the exorcist in part of its meaning.